So I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 161 of the Standing Committee on Finance. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. I would now like to remind participants of the following points. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. All comments should be addressed through the chair. Members, please raise your hand if you wish to speak, whether participating in person or via Zoom. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can. And pursuant to Standing Order 108(2), the committee is resuming its study on the report of the Bank of Canada on monetary policy. Now I'd like to welcome our witnesses from the Bank of Canada, Governor Tiff Macklem, welcome, and Senior Deputy Governor Carolyn Rogers. Welcome. And just before you get into your opening remarks, I'd just like to say thank you on behalf of the residents of Mississauga East Cooksville, and I'm sure I speak for all ridings. Been knocking on doors for many years, but over the last 2 years, some of the concerns have been around inflation, of course, and interest rates. And to see over the last while, and especially the last rate cut, the jumbo 50-point rate cut, has made a big difference, and it has helped. I could tell you at the doors, it makes a big difference to people's lives. So thank you for that, Governor and Senior Deputy Governor. And now to your opening remarks, please.
And look, we're very pleased. The Canadians are feeling some relief. We're very pleased to be here at the committee to discuss our recent policy announcement as well as our new outlook in our monetary policy report last week. So, as you highlighted last week, we lowered our policy interest rate by 50 basis points. It was our fourth consecutive interest rate cut since June and brings the policy rate to 3.75%. We took a bigger step because inflation is now back to the 2% target, and we want to keep it close to the target. In the past few months, inflation has come down significantly. Headline inflation was 1.6% in September, and both our measures of core were under 2.5%. Price pressures are no longer broad-based. Our surveys also find that business and consumer expectations of inflation have shifted down and are nearing normal. All this suggests we're back to low inflation. That is good news for Canadians. Now our focus is to maintain low and stable inflation. We need to stick the landing. That means the upward and downward forces on inflation need to balance out. Economic activity picked up this year, but it is still soft. This softness has helped to take the remaining steam out of inflation. But with inflation now back at 2%, we want to see growth strengthen. Last week's interest rate decision should contribute to a pickup in demand. Soutenu par les taux plus bas.
Looking ahead, we expect the economy to gradually strengthen in 2025-26, supported by lower interest rates. Population growth will be slower, but we anticipate consumer spending per capita to be picking up. We also expect growth in residential investments to rise as strong demand for housing sales and spending on renovations. We expect business investment to strengthen as demand picks up, and exports should remain strong, supported by robust demand from the United States. Our forecast has inflation staying around the target over the projection horizon. The upward pressure from shelter and other services is expected to gradually diminish. With stronger demand, the downward pressure on inflation should also dissipate, keeping the upward and downward forces roughly balanced. There are risks around our inflation outlook. The biggest downside risk to inflation is that it could take longer than anticipated for households spending and business investment to pick up. On the upside, lower interest rates could fuel a stronger rebound in housing activity, or wage growth could remain high relative to productivity. We're also facing elevated geopolitical uncertainty and the risk of new shocks. Overall, we view the risks around our inflation forecast as reasonably balanced.
Broadly in line with our forecast, we anticipate cutting our policy rate further to support demand and keep inflation on target. The timing and pace of our interest rate cuts will depend on incoming information and our assessment of its implications for the inflation outlook. In other words, we'll continue to take our monetary policy decisions one at a time. Let me conclude. As you highlighted at the outset, Chair, high inflation and interest rates have been a heavy burden on Canadians. Now we're coming out the other side. Monetary policy has worked to get inflation down. And with inflation back to target and interest rates continuing to come down, families, businesses, and communities should feel some relief. The bank is committed to maintaining price stability for Canadians by keeping inflation close to the 2% target. And with that, Senior Deputy Governor and I would be very pleased to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you again, Governor, Senior Deputy Governor, and I'm sure there are going to be many questions from the members. We are starting with MP Morantz for the first 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Governor, Senior Deputy Governor. It's great to see you here again at committee. Governor, it's been widely reported that our GDP per capita is at its lowest growth rate since the 1930s. That GDP per capita has declined now, according to Stats Canada. It declined in the second quarter. That was the 5th consecutive quarter in a row. Now, also it's been reported Canada lags significantly behind the U.S. in GDP per capita, a trend that's continuing. In fact, Canada is now at 71% of the U.S. economy. We rank 18th in the OECD and 6th out of 7 in the G7, ahead of only Italy. Now, yesterday at a summit in Toronto, you said fixing Canada's productivity problems will likely take a top-to-bottom overhaul of government rules that obstruct people's ability to do their best work and businesses' ability to grow. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, tax policies, competition policy, IP policy, we need to look at those. So my first question has to do with the increase in the capital gains inclusion rate. Are you concerned, or do you find it unhelpful to deal with our productivity crisis, which is the label that the Senior Deputy Governor put on it back in the spring, when the government goes and makes such a massive increase to such an important tax?
Well, you won't be surprised that I'm not going to comment on specific tax measures.
I'm not asking you. I'm asking you as an economist to say whether or not you think an increase in tax like this is going to adversely affect or be unhelpful in solving the productivity crisis that your own office labeled a productivity crisis break glass. So I'm not sure you can label it as a crisis and not respond to a reasonable question about a major tax increase.
Look, what I will say, coming back to my remarks yesterday, we have a number of framework policies in this country: inflation control policy, fiscal policy, competition policy, tax policy, IP policy, and my message yesterday was really that yes, we have a serious productivity problem in this country, and there needs to be a concerted effort to look at these framework policies through the lens of productivity. It's really up to elected officials, up to Parliament, up to governments to decide on specific measures. And I'm not going to comment on specific measures, but I do think it would be helpful to look at these through the lens of productivity.
Well, as an economist, I'm sure you're familiar with tax incidence theory. If you put a tax on something, do you get less of it?
Look, as an economist, I understand how taxes work, but I'm the governor of the Bank of Canada, and I'm not going to comment on specific tax measures.
You already opened the door to it when your office put out a grand statement in the spring saying that Canada was in a productivity crisis. So now, I'm sorry, Governor, it sounds like you're dodging the question. The government took a measure that is going to adversely affect the exact problem that you have warned them they need to solve. So I think it is incumbent on you as the bank Governor of the Bank of Canada to say. When you increase a tax like this, don't you hurt productivity at a time when we need to be enhancing our productivity?
Look, I think it's incumbent on the government to talk to the tax measures they're taking, not to the Governor of the Bank of Canada.
So you're not gonna answer that one. What about you talked about top to bottom overhaul of government rules, which that obstruct people's ability to do their best work. Could you specifically point out which policies of the government have obstructed people's ability to do their best work and businesses' ability to grow?
So yes, just to sort of back up a little bit to the comments that you're quoting yesterday. So I talked about sort of three big buckets that I think need attention if we're going to tackle this very serious productivity problem. And we've talked about the first one. There's a broad range of framework policies. The second one I somewhat provocatively called the own goals, the obstacles, the things that we've done that were well-intentioned policies but are barriers to increasing productivity growth. And so speaking to those, there are many interprovincial trade barriers. There are interprovincial separate, provincial qualifications for lawyers, for electricians, for doctors that make it more difficult for people to move around the country. We've been very good at bringing immigrants into the country. We're not as good at recognizing their credentials so that they can get the most productive job that they could in Canada. And then the other thing, certainly I hear a lot of, particularly when I'm outside of the country, I often hear from large foreign investors, we're very interested in investing more in Canada. North America is a great place to be. You've got rule of law, you're a stable country, many attractive features, lots of talent, but the timeline to get regulatory approvals is very long, and it's uncertain, and that is a barrier to us
I'm sorry,
investing.
Governor, my time is almost up.
So those are the things I was talking about.
Okay.
Thank you, MP Morantz. And now we're going to MP Thompson for the next 6 minutes.
Actually, I'm going to pass my time to P.S. Bendayan.
Thank you so much for being here with us, Governor, and thank you, Mr. Chair. In the last monetary policy from just last week, the Bank of Canada does point out that wage growth remains elevated at about 4%, which is 2.5 times where inflation is at currently. We've had now 20 straight months of wage growth outpacing inflation, Governor, and if we compare to previous data, we also see that the purchasing power of Canadians has also considerably increased. I also saw that data is showing that consumer confidence in Canada is on the rise. It's actually at a 30-month high and higher now than it was when Prime Minister Harper left office. Governor, I know that data isn't everything, but the data does indicate some good news. I wonder, firstly, if you can confirm that that information is accurate, that data is accurate, but also give us a sense, Governor, because I think what I hear at the doorstops, what my colleagues hear when they knock on doors, is that Canadians are not feeling that right now. Can you give us, firstly, the data picture, but also maybe help explain why there might be some disconnect?
Well, with respect to the data picture, look, it is somewhat mixed. If as Mr. Morantz highlighted, GDP or consumption per capita has been very weak. Households have felt the impact of higher interest rates. They've cut back on their spending. They've increased their savings. You can see that the savings rate has gone up quite a bit. It's at 8%. In terms of consumer confidence, it was very low. It has come up, but it's still, it's moved up pretty modestly. I think the good news is it's not going down. It's moving in the right direction, but it's not high. And when we do our own surveys of consumers, you can see the combined impact of high inflation and high interest rates on on their mood, on their spending plans. Looking forward, we have lowered interest rates now 4 times since June. You are starting to see some impact of that. Some of it is more anecdotal. I expect we will see more in the data going forward. So the way I would put it is that the table is set for growth to pick up. I think there is it always takes some time for lower interest rates to pass through and affect households. Some people are affected right away. If you've got a variable rate mortgage, the day we cut interest rate, it affects you right away. If you're renewing, it takes some time. So different people are affected. It takes some time to pass through. But we have been cutting since June. It should start to pass through. So we do expect to see consumption per capita, which has been negative, to start to strengthen and actually become positive as you move through next year.
And I also saw that GDP per capita is expected to increase in 2025, as you predicted.
Right. The two are closely related, given that consumption is a big part of GDP.
You mentioned that this is the 4th straight rate cut. This is actually, Canada is the first G7 country to have 4 straight rate cuts. I wonder if you could comment a little bit about how Canada's economy compares to our G7 peers. To my mind, certainly, when you look at our global peers, Canada is faring very well and is doing better in terms of an economic and a faster economic recovery than others.
Well, it depends who you compare to. The U.S. is certainly doing better than Canada. The U.S. economy has proven very resilient. The U.S. is seeing a very strong investment boom. And you're seeing, considerable resilience of U.S. consumers to higher interest rates. Recently the revisions to their national income and products accounts suggest that, showed that actually income was even higher than we previously thought. Savings in the U.S.
I don't mean
higher.
to interrupt, but Canada is, for the first time, 3rd in the world in foreign direct investment. I mean, I agree with you. The U.S. economy is doing well, but
I would say, relative to Europe, the Canadian economy is doing quite well. So it depends who you compare to yourself to, and it also depends, what what exactly you're measuring. You're going to do better on some things, not as well on other things.
perhaps just a last word, Mr. Chair, if I have a moment to hear you on the impact of lower interest rates on housing and the importance of that for the people who are watching us at home. I think housing has been a major issue, and we would like to bring relief, particularly to young Canadians. Perhaps you'd like to comment there.
Yeah, we do expect lower interest rates will bring people back into the housing market. We do think there's some people that have been waiting for rates to come down. So rates are one thing that'll help. We still need the push on the supply side, because that will ultimately be what sort of rebalances housing affordability in Canada. But we do think rates are going to give some relief, particularly to new entrants.
I take that to mean that it's important for us to continue to invest in housing and ensure that the supply side is there.
Thank you, P.S. And Diane, thank you. That's the time. And now to MP Samari, please.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président. Bonjour.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, and thank you so much to our two witnesses for being here today. Several questions. A technical question on the same subject. Last year, mid-September 2023, the government announced that it was abolishing the GST on buildings, certain buildings. Is there support for this type of measure? And we have not made a study precisely dealing with this question. So you haven't been able to evaluate the effects of it? No. It has to be microeconomic for us. Another completely different subject, Donald Trump. Recently, he reiterated his position with respect to tariffs on imports. He was talking about 10% across the board on imports, but now 20%, and for China, 60%. Taking all of this into account, The trade relations between Canada and the United States are important, quite aside from the world economy. What effect would that have on the Canadian economy and monetary policy, particularly with respect to keeping inflation low and stable? As I have already pointed out, I really can't make any comments on policies, specific policies in Canada, and certainly not on those of the United States. But I can say this. The world is becoming a more difficult place, a more difficult environment. You have wars, the Ukrainian attacked, the war in the Middle East, and there is increasing economic fragmentation amongst countries, more tariffs being put on, more trade barriers. So that is a force in the world. That is happening. We will see who wins the election in the United States, and that may determine how these forces are managed. But yes, it certainly is an environment that would lead to more complicated change. The issues of economic security, national security, all of this enters into the decisions that are taken, and tariffs, of course, and the rules, the trade rules that are involved. What this means for Canada, one good thing is that we have a very good trade relationship with the United States. Everybody knows that the most important destination for the goods we produce is the United States. And Canada is the largest taker, the largest recipient of American exports as well. So I think it's good for both countries. Thank you. On another matter, inflation has gone down. To date, we haven't had a recession. But if you compare to the beginning of the 1970s, inflation played an important role. And it sort of dropped before it rose again. So the resurgence of inflation in the 1970s can be explained in part by an excessively flexible monetary policy. Given these facts, and in view of the fact that markets are so important, do you think that there is any risk that monetary policy might lead to a similar situation as existed in the 1970s? We have made our forecasts, and yes, there are risks on both sides. Now that we're down to 2% inflation, in the range of 2%, we are looking at our forecasts. And I was at the International Monetary Fund in Washington last week, and I can say that major central banks are revising their interest rates and doing it prudently, and not too quickly, but not too slowly either, just the way it has to be done. So you can see that we started to lower our rates before the United States. That reflects, of course, different situations in different countries. We want to have a flexible exchange rate, and that is what Canada needs to meet its needs. Thank you. Mr. St. Marie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Governor and Deputy Governor, for being with us. Governor, year-over-year inflation appears now to be 1.6%. That's below the Bank of Canada's stated target, and some feel it's likely to fall further in the coming months. Can you please reconfirm that 2% is your target for inflation, not a ceiling?
Oh,
Yes, absolutely. 2% is a target, and we treat 2% entirely symmetrically.
Thank you. You said a few months ago that the bank had to continue tightening even when inflation had reached the 3% upper band because it was important to get right back to the 2%. I think we took from that it wasn't good enough just to reach the band. Now that inflation is below 2%, can you confirm that it's equally important now to lift inflation back to 2%? Is that your goal?
Yeah, I think we've been pretty clear. We've got inflation down to 2%. We want to keep it there. With respect to the fact that inflation is 1.6, so obviously 0.4 under 2%. I mean, I think month to month you're going to see some volatility. We're obviously, literally, we can't hit 2% every month. When if you look at our projection, we expect in the next few months it is going to tick back up closer to 2%. So, and it may even go a little above 2%. It's going to depend to some degree on on what happens with global oil prices. But yes, we are very much. I think we've been very clear. We've got inflation down to 2. We don't want it to keep falling. We want it to stay close to 2. That's our job, and that has been an important factor in our interest rate decisions.
Thank you. Now, in the Bank of Canada's October 2024 monetary policy report, it stated the housing vacancy rate remains near record lows. Interest rate cuts, which of course you've talked about, the 50 basis points, pent-up demand, and the recent changes in mortgage rules could spur more demand for housing than expected in the projection. Governor, will the expected boost in demand put upward pressure on housing prices?
I mean, it could. That's, when we talk about risks on both sides, that is a risk that we continue to monitor. As I answered the question earlier, we are expecting some pickup in housing activity. We do think there's people wanting into the housing market that have been waiting for rates to come down. That'll help. So we are expecting some increase. If that activity picks up too much, it could start to put upward pressure on house prices again.
And what would be the Bank of Canada's response if that happens?
I think it would depend a lot on what else is going on in the economy, right? If we're back in our range, this is why it's important to stay in the range. As the governor said, whether it's oil or some other sort of shock that's happening to the economy that isn't a more generalized increase in prices, that's sort of the inflation that we get concerned about when it's a generalized increase in prices. Right. So, yeah.
I guess this is the perverse multifactorial world that we're living in, where we get these salutary effects, and that allows more people to afford houses, but it puts more demand in the market, which can drive price up. And of course, I think there's not an MP in this room that isn't concerned about high prices for housing in our ridings. How much of the current year-over-year inflation of 1.6% is due to higher mortgage debt charges?
I don't have the precise number, but I mean, certainly mortgage interest cost is a significant contributor to inflation. What you're seeing, if you look at, shelter costs, which also includes rents, home insurance, all those pieces are high. Shelter overall is going up at about 8%, and that's contributing more than a percentage point of inflation. So it is a very large component. What we're seeing is on the mortgage interest cost, with the cuts to interest rates, that's starting to come down. You're also starting to see rents. There's some evidence rents are starting to come off, and particularly if you look at data on new rents, those rent increases are quite a lot lower than the stock of rents in the CPI. So we have become more confident that shelter price inflation is rolling over and starting to come down. That's certainly good news. And that confidence that's the biggest upward pressure on inflation. With that coming off, that has given us more confidence that we can lower interest rates to get growth up, and the two will balance out and will stay closer to 2.
My research says Canada estimates it at 0.6%, or about 37.5% of the total. Does that ring a bell? About a third? Yeah.
I mean, I was looking. The numbers I had in front of me were more total shelter, which also includes rent and home insurance.
According to Stats Canada, again, the youth unemployment rate was up 2.8 percentage points on a year-over-year basis in September. It's at 13.5%. This was more than double the overall unemployment rate, and it reflects increases among both young men. It's up 3.7 percent points to 15.3%. Unemployment among young men and young women is about 11.5. It's up 1.8%. Governor, what impact have the Bank of Canada's past interest rate increases had in driving this increase in youth unemployment across Canada? And I'm wondering how that'll factor into future policy decisions.
Well, it is factoring into policy decisions. So, look, we raised rates very forcefully to get inflation down. It worked, but it hasn't been painless. When inflation was 8%, we had a very overheated labor market. That was part of the inflation problem. The good news is much of the adjustment in the labor market came through vacancies as opposed to rising unemployment. Companies reduced their posted job vacancies. They didn't lay people off. What you're seeing now is we still see that layoffs are actually not particularly high. They're fairly normal levels. But what has been weak is hiring has been weak. Population growth has been strong. Hiring has been weak. So there have been more people entering the labor force than are finding jobs. And, who are the people that are entering the labor force? Well, they're mostly younger people looking for their first job. And so, yes, what you're seeing is that they have been particularly affected by the weak hiring. So you're seeing youth employment rates have gone up a lot. If you look at the unemployment rates of, say, 25 to 55-year-olds, they've actually moved much less. So, what's that's telling us, though, is that, those job vacancies have come down a lot. When you talk to businesses, they're not having trouble finding workers the way they were in the past. There are certainly pockets where they're having trouble, but overall, they report that labor is they can find the workers they need. So, yes, we need to see job growth pick up now. We've got inflation back to 2%. We want to see hiring pick up so that, those young people aren't spending as long a time in unemployment and are finding those jobs. And going forward, as interest rates pass through, as demand comes back, we do expect job growth to pick up.
Thank you, MP Davies. And members, we're moving into our second round and have MP Howland up first.
Thanks, Chair. Governor, Deputy Governor, thanks for being here. Governor, the CMHC, their September numbers show that there's a downward trend in housing starts. In your January monetary policy report, you highlight in there that strong population growth is supporting inflation in rental prices. Since January, have you seen this trend continue? That it's the drastic increase in the population growth that has continued to keep rent inflation high?
I think there's more than one thing that's contributed to rent inflation. Certainly an imbalance between the demand and supply. So and that's the numbers that CMHC is talking about. And inflation. There's no single variable that has contributed to this. But yeah.
In your report, it doesn't highlight anything else. It just says in here, a larger increase in newcomers than in the past is adding pressure to the structural supply constraint in housing. So one would take it from your own report that is the factor, correct?
Yeah, so what our report says is that there's a structural imbalance between supply and demand, and when you're adding more demand than you're adding supply, you're making that worse.
And so given that, after that January report, did you see any changes, or is it the same reason that has kept rent inflation the way it is?
I don't think there's been a big change since.
What you can see is that rent inflation has ticked down a little bit, but there's a big stock of rents, and people renew their rents at different times. So it takes a while for new rents to feed into the average rent. What's in the CPI is the average rent increase. So we are starting to see some evidence, and I want to be clear, it's not, we don't have as good data on this, But the new rents, so I'm getting to your question.
Just
The new rents
respectfully,
are
the
coming
rent
down.
inflation has not changed to below 8% for the whole year, which is an indication that nothing has really changed. What I take your monetary report as was a warning in January when you wrote what you wrote. At the same time, 2 years ago, the government's own department had warned them that they were going to increase the population so drastically that there was a housing crisis and it would get even worse. That was the government's own department. Given the numbers that we have of rent inflation being over 8%, my question is, if the government had heeded your warning and its own department's warning, would we not have seen as drastic of a rent inflation as we did over the past few years, but especially this year since it stayed above 8 the whole year?
Look, I think it's fair to say that the imbalance between demand and supply was further exaggerated by the large population increase that added a lot to demand, and yes, that put upward pressure on rents.
And so my question is, if they had heeded the warnings from the bank and their own department this year, do you think that it would have had less pressure on rent inflation?
If there had been less population growth, there would have been less pressure on rent inflation.
And the reason why I'm saying that is because there was a really damning report yesterday from Food Banks Canada that now there's more than 2 million Canadians going into a food bank in a single month. This is something that when we talk about doorsteps, we see the pain, we hear the pain from Canadians all over. Whereas 40% of someone's paycheck used to be on housing costs, now it's up to 60 and sometimes 80%. There's less money for Canadians. And now we're seeing more food bank usage. And when you look at the population growth, the rapid increase that the government had implied, my question is that with food bank usage going up so much right now, like what is your message to those people? Because, it seemed like my colleagues from the Liberal side had painted such a rosy picture, but 2 million plus Canadians are going into a food bank in a single month.
There's no question that, particularly for people at the lower end of the income distribution, it's been a very tough couple of years. High inflation was particularly concentrated in food, it's in rent. These are necessities. You can't cut back on necessities. They're necessities. The best thing we can do is to get inflation down so that they can have more confidence that their cost of living is not going to keep rising the way it was 2 years ago. Right. We've done that. That's good news.
But just to that point, so those people that you're talking about that are lower income, would you not agree that in giving them or raising taxes on them only hurts them further, such as like a carbon tax, or if government spending means that they're going to increase taxes on Canadians, does that not hurt them further?
Look, I really don't want to get into commenting on specific tax measures. I think I've been pretty clear. I completely agree with you that lower income people have been hit hardest by high inflation. And, that is one of the reasons why low inflation is such an important policy.
I just...
MP Allen, that's the time. Now we're off to MP Baker, please.
Governor, Senior Deputy Governor, it's good to see you again, and thank you for being back here at committee. Governor, when I'm out there knocking on doors in my community in Etobicoke Center, I've heard a lot of folks talk to me about the rising cost of living, the impact that that's had on their quality of life. But an issue that I also hear from a lot of folks is the question, when are interest rates going to come down, right? And these are folks who have mortgages, who may be variable rates, so those rates are fluctuating as the interest rate rises and comes down. But there's also folks who are on fixed mortgage rates and are worried about renewing, and that they'll be renewing at a much higher payment level as a result of higher interest rates, and that would cost them more, and they may not be able to sustain that. So every time you come here to committee, I ask you, when are interest rates going to come down? And that's why I ask this question, because this is one of the most common questions I get from my constituents. I think the question I want to ask you today is, well, let me first say that I think I've heard from a number of my constituents who who have felt relief from the recent interest rates cuts, the 4 consecutive interest rates cuts, especially this last one of 50 basis points. But I still get questions from constituents who are saying, are interest rates going to come down further? And if so, when? What can I tell my constituents when they ask me that question?
Well, what we've said, and I think we've been very clear since we started cutting rates, that if the economy continues to evolve broadly in line with our forecast, we anticipate further cuts in our policy rate. We've also been very clear that the exact timing, the size of those cuts is going to depend on incoming data. So, the data leading up to our decision last week, CPI inflation came down significantly. The economy, it is growing, but the recent indicators a little more slowly in the second half than in the first half. You looked at you looked at our surveys, you looked at inflation expectations. The message was it's appropriate to take a bigger step, and that's what we did. Looking forward, yes, I think the message is to Canadians, it's reasonable to expect interest rates will continue to come down. The question that, sort of the next question, the question often feeds into this. Okay, so how low are they going to go? Where's the terminal point? And my message there is, look, we're going to have to discover where we land. We don't know exactly where we land. We have this concept of the neutral interest rate, which is where the interest rate would be when inflation's at target, economy's at capacity, and there's no shocks disturbing the economy. We can't observe that directly, so we have to kind of discover where that is. And then the other reality is there will be shocks, there will be disturbances, there will be new events, there will be surprises, and the interest rate is the thing that we adjust to keep inflation on target. Remember, we have an inflation target. I think the message to Canadians is, our commitment is to try to keep inflation low and stable. We're going to do the best we can at that. We've been pretty good at that over time. The interest rate's the thing we use to do that, so it will have to respond. So, yes, I think the direction of travel is down, but we're going to have to see where the destination is, and we're going to take it one decision at a time.
So I appreciate that. I think I have about a minute and a half, and I have 2 questions. One I hope is a brief one, and one maybe a little bit longer, so I'll be quick. The first one is, are you able to give us just a quick update, very briefly? My understanding is that the Bank of Canada was doing some work on incorporating the impact of climate change in its macroeconomic models. In other words, what's the impact of climate change on cost of living and other aspects of our economy? Can you just quickly update us on where that stands?
I don't have much to say new from where we were last time we were here. We are still working that. We don't have those models in production yet. This is not a small undertaking.
Good. Last question is, I have a constituent by the name of Joe Polito, and he asks me a question regularly about the Bank of Canada. He points out that the Bank of Canada pays interest on settlement balances. There's bank deposits at the Bank of Canada, and he's told me that historically the Bank of Canada didn't always used to do that. But we do that now. And the question he asked me is why we do that. Isn't that a great benefit? We're paying a lot of money. The Bank of Canada is paying a lot of money in interest on these settlement balances of the banks. It's a great benefit to the banks. Why would we do that? Wouldn't we save a lot of money by not paying that interest on those settlement balances? Could you tell us why we do that?
Short answer is that's how we control the overnight rate.
Yeah. And the other thing Joe maybe has told you is in the past we didn't have a lot of settlement balances. We ran a system where we maintained very, very low settlement balances. We expect to get back to a lower level, but yeah, that's the overnight rate. That's how we implement monetary policy.
Thank you, MP Baker, and I hope Joe Polito is watching. And now we're going to...
I guarantee he's watching.
Yeah, to MP somebody, please.
Thank you, Chair. Markets were thinking that you would reduce the inflation rate, but there was also talk about 1/4 point because of the situation in September with the cost of gasoline, and the Bank of Canada in the past had never brought forward a huge cut, during a cycle of recession, as was the case, say, in 2001. So this large cut that you've made, are you signaling that this is a precursor, perhaps, to a recession? I don't really think that you should think that there is a crisis or a recession. Just remember this. In recent years, there have been extreme fluctuations, wide swings of inflation, inflation being created so quickly over the past 40 years. We hadn't seen that. And now when we start to normalize the interest rates, we go by steps that are perhaps a little larger than normal. And so, yes, there have been major changes, 100 basis point at one point. But when we do take a larger reduction, it reflects the fact that the situation is changing. Thank you. With respect to exports to the United States from Canada, it has helped our economy, but the American economy seems to be closing itself off to outside exports. Do you think that this will have an effect on Canadian exports to the United States and the economy overall? We have a trade agreement with the United States. If you look at trade with the United States, in 2000, Canada had the largest share of imports from the United States. But China increased since then, and Canada is now third. In China, with the new tariffs and all the restrictions, China is going down, Mexico's number one, and Canada has got back to number two in terms of imports. So there are opportunities for Canada. There are changes that occur in the supply chain and in trade, in world trade overall. We are close to the Americans. We have a lot of successful trade with them. We do business with the Americans. And yes, our trade relationship with the United States could change, but I'm very optimistic. I'm more optimistic about Canada's opportunities. Thank you, Mr. St. Marie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Governor, I'd like to ask you about the impact of immigration. In the Bank of Canada's October monetary policy report, GDP growth was projected to continue at around 2% through the first half of 2025 before increasing modestly to about 2.5% in the second half and reaching 2.3% in 2026. And now that projection assumed that population growth would decline from about 2.5% in the second half of this year to an average quarterly growth of 1.5% over the rest of the projection. However, we know the immigration reduction targets announced by the federal government last week are expected to result in a population decline of 0.2% in both 2025 and 2026 before returning to growth in 2027. Given that a population decline means fewer consumers and workers will be participating in the economy, what impact will the federal government's immigration reduction targets have on the central bank's growth forecasts?
Well, thank you for the question. Yes, as you outlined, shortly after we'd published our forecast, the government published a new level plan for their immigration. So, you know, as you indicated, we have a pretty sizable reduction in population growth in our current forecast. And what's going on in our forecast? There are two things. So population growth is coming down, and you know, as you highlighted, less population growth means fewer new consumers in your economy, so that's going to be less growth in demand. At the same time, with lower interest rates, we have consumption per capita coming up. And in the short, over the next few quarters, they roughly balance off. So growth is about 2%. So the upshot of the government's new level plan is they've lowered the target for permanent residents, and there's also there's more concrete targets on the net flows of non-permanent residents. Those are below the forecast that or the assumptions that we have in our forecast, quite significantly. And so, we will be incorporating, our next forecast is in January. We will take a look at that. We will incorporate it. We will certainly take that into account. I will say that there are a lot of moving parts here on the immigration. There's inflows, there's outflows. You've got to net those. When you look at non-permanent residents, there's students, there's asylum seekers, there's temporary foreign workers, there's special visas for Ukrainians. There are decisions that are going to have to be taken on all of those pieces. We'll be looking at all that, and we'll be incorporating it. But yes, I mean, if you take it, you take what they put out, it would imply a lower GDP growth forecast.
Take on. Again, we're well over, so but off to MP Chambers now for the next 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Governor, Senior Deputies. Well, it's very nice to have you back. Just want to talk about prominent payment systems just for a moment. I'm going to try to link this to the productivity discussion. My understanding is that Interact's e-transfer service is considered a prominent payment system under the Bank of Canada. That's correct, right? It's been designated. But I also understand that Interact is in non-compliance with the standards that the bank sets out with respect to at least two of the standards. Primarily, one, that the criteria for joining Interact is public, and two, that their pricing mechanism should be risk-based, not volume-based. Now, the problem I have here is that, one, there's no transparency. The bank has requested through the standards that there is transparency. And two, the fee schedule is secret, but we know that it's volume-based based on testimony yesterday at industry committee. So my question is there any enforcement actions against Interact to bring them in compliance?
So I think you're, I think we're talking about two different things. So there is a set of global standards for payment systems that articulate the kinds of things you're talking about. Our enforcement powers relate to Retail Payments Act. So when you talk about an enforcement action.
Well, you regulate e-transfers, correct? Or they are considered a prominent payment system for e-transfers, right?
Yes.
And the Bank of Canada has listed that the standards it expects those entities, the prominent payment systems, to comply with. Interact is not in compliance. They've admitted it. It's not a secret.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering, is the bank pressuring them to do the things that you've asked them to do?
Yes, we are working with them.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, you used the word enforcement measure, so yes. Are we working with Interact on those standards? Yes.
I guess I would say you have political cover to push them much further because it's 10 years since the bank has admitted that modernization to retail payments has a significant economic upside. And if we're worried about productivity, I would think that you could lean on this organization and Payments Canada, which, by the way, gave a sole source contract to an entity that's completely ripe with conflicts of interest, which is owned by the banks, right? They have an incentive to not modernize to protect that profit pool, but they're in non-compliance. So I'm very glad to hear that you're working with them.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is we are working closely with Payments Canada. I mean, having a fast payment system in Canada is an important step for productivity. It's an important step for our economy. It's an objective that we support.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll switch back. My understanding is it clear from or would it be safe to say from your testimony that the fight against inflation is not over, that there is risk that it could recelebrate? Is that a fair assessment?
I'd say we've reached a very important milestone. We've got inflation low again.
Is the fight over? Is the fight over?
No.
Okay. So there's provincial elections all across the country. There's a federal election coming up at least within the next year. You've got provinces promising to send people checks. You have the PBO saying that the government's blowing through its deficit target. Sounds to me like a lot of fiscal stimulus. What recommendations would you have for governments who are considering a lot of fiscal stimulus when the fight against inflation is not over? Do you support additional fiscal stimulus?
So, normally we don't comment at all on fiscal policy. When inflation was high and we were working very hard to get inflation down, we did express concern that if there was a lot more spending, and in particular if fiscal spending was well above potential growth, that could make it more difficult to get inflation back down. We've now got inflation back down. So I'm really not feeling the need to comment on fiscal policy.
So
really, fiscal policy is your job. Monetary policy is
fair
your
enough.
job.
Would you say to tread carefully? Would that be a fair recommendation that you would provide politicians who can't help themselves but spend, including provincial governments? I'm an equal offender here.
Tread carefully, but look, I'm not here to give you fiscal policy advice. We are here to talk about monetary policy.
Thank you, Governor.
Chambers, and now to MP Zarowitz.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Deputy Governor, for being here today and for this important discussion. I am spending an exorbitant amount of time visiting small businesses in my riding of Davenport. They're struggling because after the pandemic, input prices, some of them have not gone down, and they continue to remain very high. Consumers have changed. The economy's changed. The world has changed. And so many of them are pivoting. And so maybe the question I have for you, how does the recent interest rate cut impact Canadian businesses?
Well, certainly, when I run into businesses, they often express considerable pleasure to see, they're quite happy to see the interest rate coming down. I mean, look, it lowers their cost of borrowing. Whether that's investing in new capital or paying for their working capital to buy their inventories, it takes one less cost for them down. I think the other thing that is going on though is with low inflation, they're facing less uncertainty about fluctuations in their input costs. It doesn't mean they've all come back to where they were, but the rate of change has come back.
Thank you. That's helpful. And the other question I had, and Mr. Chambers kind of touched a little bit on this, we at the federal level made it a point to ensure that we kept government spending to a new goalpost of 1% of GDP. Do you believe that this us keeping our spending to 1% of GDP has contributed to inflation falling, or at least keeping it under control?
Well, look, I've said in the past that I think the fiscal guideposts are helpful. I think they give more predictability, more certainty.
And the other thing, so I do a lot of canvassing, and I would say to you, when I talk to my constituents, some of them will say, Julie, I'm worried that the carbon tax, so our carbon pricing, is making everything expensive. Governor, one of the misinformations that's out there, or disinformation, is that if we eliminate the carbon pricing or carbon tax, all the prices will go down. If we eliminate our carbon pricing, will all prices go down?
Well, if the tax is not applied to it, there's no direct effect. I mean, there could be an indirect effect, but there's no direct effect.
Sorry, there's no direct effect on what?
Well, I mean, I've talked many times about, our estimates. So when we do it, what we do is we look at the incidence on the fuel categories that the carbon tax affects. So if you take the carbon tax off, yes, the prices of those fuel categories will come down. But, that's going to be the direct incidence of getting rid of the carbon tax on prices.
But it won't won't be that everything, all prices go down. So food prices go down, transportation prices go down beyond the fuel price. Like the expectation, and there's this belief out there that it is the carbon pricing that somehow has caused everything to be expensive. So if you eliminate the carbon tax, everything will then go back to normal and the prices will be back to normal. That is honestly the belief that is out there. So for my constituents, if we eliminate the carbon pricing or carbon tax, would all the prices go down? Okay, thank you. We talked about productivity, and I know everybody on this committee knows how much I've been trying to tackle both interprovincial trade barriers. It does take a while to tackle, but we have to get started. I was reading the Draghi report. Europe's also having some productivity issues as well. My question to you is, what are the similarities? What are the similarities in our productivity issues, and where is it that we are different and specifically need to focus on?
Well, look, that is a very big topic. There are some similarities, but there are also a lot of differences. So Canada, unlike the European Union, Canada is a country. We have a unified banking system. We have large national banks that span the country. We have a unified capital market system. So we have a federal tax system that spans the whole country. We have equalization payments between different parts of the country. We have a fiscal union. So we have a lot of whereas Europe, it has a monetary union, but it doesn't have those other things. So there are some very important differences. As I highlighted in response to Mr. Moran's question, we still have, there are small differences between provinces that, get in the way of doing business that, I think we could agree to have some mutual recognition on to the benefit of all the provinces. So we have some unnecessary barriers, but we're starting from a pretty different place from Europe.
Pete Zarowitz, members, we are now moving into our third round of questions, and MP Kelly will start off the top.
Thank you, and thank you, Governor, for clarifying for everyone that if the carbon tax is removed from things like fuel, the price of these items will in fact go down. So that was, I think, helpful to have on the record. Would that go for everything, all other sort of products that are tied to this? So if a truck that transports food no longer has the tax applied to it, then we are easing the input cost on food, for example.
I don't have an estimate of the secondary effects, but the direct effects on overall inflation are relatively modest. The secondary effects are going to be even more modest. So, I'm not saying there aren't some products where that could be important, but if you look, what we're looking at is CPI inflation, everything in the basket. And when you look at it that way, the secondary effects are going to be de minimis.
Back to at the very end of your response to Mr. Morantz's last question, you were beginning to talk about timelines for project approvals and the impact that has on productivity, the drag on productivity. So I'd like you to maybe complete your answer, if you'd like to, and talk about how regulatory timelines create delay, which creates a drag on productivity, which is where we get this declining per capita GDP that we have in Canada.
So, look, we have well-intentioned regulations at different levels, federal, provincial, municipal in this country. These are well-intentioned regulations. They want to make sure that these investments are in the best interests. The difficulty is at times we have overlapping, sometimes even conflicting regulatory approval processes. They're tough for investors, people who want to build, to navigate, and there can be considerable uncertainty in how long it's going to take. So,
if I may,
so what that does, it scares investors off.
Indeed. So, so delays on that capital will go somewhere else. For example, United States. Yeah, and the gap in investment, the investment deficit with the United States, the difference between American investment in Canada and Canadian investment in the United States is now. Do you have a
I don't have the
statistic
number
on
in
that?
front of me, but
Okay.
there's no question that too many companies, so foreign capital, even some Canadian capital, is going to the United States because they can get faster regulatory approvals.
Right, and we've heard at this committee that difference is almost $500 billion. That sound about right and roughly.
Yeah, I don't
correct.
have a number, but it's a big number.
Okay, so can you tell us about? Would you care to name some of the specific regulatory obstacles to investment?
No, I'm not going to get into sort of specific line by line issues. I think that the message is we need to look at this from a whole of country point of view, and these are well intentioned, but I think where we can streamline the process, provide more certainty, that's going to encourage investment. The productivity problem, it's a long-standing problem. It's going to take, this is something along with getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers. These are some things that we know what the problem. We know there's a problem. We know what it is. It's going to take some concerted effort to cut through it. But it's something we could do that, if we can do it, could have pretty good return in the short run.
So is it wise then to increase capital gains taxes when you are in an acknowledged productivity crisis and an investment crisis where investment is going to other peer countries and not into Canada? Is that a wise time to raise a tax on investment?
I think I've said everything I'm going to say on that question.
Okay, I'll take that as no, that it is not a good time to raise a tax. But I don't know if I have any time left for another question.
10 seconds.
Then any C69, is that a good one as far as barriers to investment then?
I'm not going to comment on specific legislation.
Thank you, MP Kelly, and now to MP Sorbara, please.
Thank you, Chair. Welcome, Governor. Welcome, Deputy Governor. We have right now in the Canadian economy inflation that has fallen and is down, interest rates that have fallen, and the Bank of Canada, under your leadership, reduced the last cut by 50 basis points, 125 basis points, and we have an economy that is growing, moderately, but growing. And in fact, in 2025, in a few weeks when we enter the new year, is forecasted by the International Monetary Fund to have the fastest growth rate in all the advanced economies in the G7. Governor, have we achieved the soft landing that we have spoken about and many economists have spoken about after coming out of a COVID, a war in Ukraine, and the supply chain bottlenecks?
We'll let her take all the credit. We'll let her take all the credit here.
That's not a term that we use a lot, soft landing. I think the way the governor described it at the beginning, we know that getting inflation back to target and getting interest rates down and down further if the economy continues to evolve the way we expect it to is a big relief for Canadians. We are really glad to be able to deliver that relief to Canadians. But back to the question we had earlier, do we feel like our work's all done? No. It's been a long fight to get back here. The economy still, I think, doesn't feel quite back to normal to most of us. So we feel like there's still work to do to stay here, to stick the landing. Absolutely.
And I would say in your opening press conference from last week, the one line that's stuck with me, or two sentences, were all this suggests we are back to low inflation. This is good news for Canadians. If you had a probability interval, or would you say that is accurate, 95 times out of 100 or 99 times out of 100?
I mean, the one thing he's told me ever since I took this job is monetary policy works. So, it was a tough slog. I don't think we ever put odds on on the end result. I think we were confident. We just needed to stick it out.
Of course. And relating to monetary policy and the monetary policy transmission mechanism, which from about 30 years ago I remember, what would you say we learned when inflation went from below 1%, or sorry, below 2%, excuse me, to above 8%? Not due to the traditional sources of inflation where you have hyperinflation, but due to supply bottlenecks, a war in Ukraine, for example. Container prices went from $2,000 or $3,000 to ship a container from, say, Europe to Halifax to over $15,000. To get inflation back down and looking back ex post, what would you say that we have learned both on the monetary policy side and even on the fiscal policy side to get inflation back down?
We've been very much reflecting on that. Let's hope we don't have anything like COVID again, but we got to acknowledge that it is a more shock-prone world, and I think successful organizations are learning organizations. So we do want to learn the lessons. I mean, it's a big topic. I'd highlight a couple things. One, we need a better, more granular understanding of the supply side of the economy. You know, our interest rates work through demand. We have better data on demand. Most of the time, supply kind of works in the background, and most of the time, when demand goes up, supply responds. Supply comes up, companies produce more. But what we really saw in the pandemic is that when the supply system is impaired, it's disrupted, the ability of supply to respond to demand is very different, and that causes very different outcomes. The related thing I would say that we learned is that the central bank playbook, sort of the standard central bank playbook when you get a supply shock that pushes inflation up, is that, well, these supply shocks, they tend to be pretty temporary. By the time monetary policy, you raise interest rates, by the time it starts to working, inflation's probably back down. So you're better off to see through it. And I think one thing we've learned is that playbook's a bit too simplistic. The state of the economy, how you respond to supply shocks, is going to have to depend more on the state of the economy. So if the economy, what we saw is when the economy was really overheated and we got a supply shock, that was very inflationary. For most of the last 30 years, we haven't had supply shocks when the economy was in excess demand. But when it is, you get a bigger pop of inflation. So, those are a couple of the things that we learned. I think we actually are doing a comprehensive review of our COVID response that will come out early in the new year, and be pleased to come back to the committee and talk about that some more.
I just want to finish up. No.
That's it, but we do
Thank
look
you, Chair.
forward to
Thank you.
hearing about that review, Governor. And now to MP Samari.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Yes, thank you, Chair. In 2002, Canada's GDP per capita was about 80% of the U.S. level, but in 2022 it dropped to 72%. The GDP per capita in Canada was 8.6%, and now, with respect to the OECD countries, and now it's dropped much lower. So Paul Baudry said that Canada is getting poorer. So what do you believe we can do to correct this trend? And is it the high value of the American dollar?
Grande question.
Those are big questions you've just asked. But in a nutshell, it is productivity. Productivity supports growth without creating inflationary pressures. And what have we seen since 2020? Productivity in the U.S. is higher than it is in Canada. And since COVID ended, the gap has widened. In the United States, they have major investments. That adds capital. Workers have new computers, and they can innovate at work, and therefore they are more productive. There is more. They're more dynamic in terms of the creation of new business. So that gap has widened. And yes, that is why my colleague here has said that it is a major crisis here, a big one. In line with the same subject, 2 weeks, The Economist indicated that the economy is spending in R&D. There was a report on what was spent by each country in R&D, and Canada was really at the bottom of the list. So does that have a negative effect on Canada? One of the reasons why productivity is low is, as you said, less investment by business, less individual research and development, less innovation. But an even deeper question is why? Why is this all happening? Why is there less investment in research and development? Why? That is the issue that is most difficult for me, because we know that we have businesses here in Canada that are very successful. They win. They're winners in the market, in the global market. It's not that we can't do it. We're not capable. We are capable. There are businesses that are very well run, but why isn't there more? It's time for the World Series here.
But our batting average isn't as good as it should be.
We won the Nobel Prize for AI, but we're not commercializing it the way other countries are. So there's opportunity.
Thank you, MP Stabari. Now to MP Davies, please.
Well, thanks. So, although we're all quite happy that inflation's down, and the rate at which prices are increasing has slowed. Across Canada, price levels also remain elevated. According to Stats Canada, compared with September 2021, the CPI rose 12.7%. In September, Canadians continue to feel the impact of higher price levels for day-to-day basics such as rent and food purchased from stores, which increased 21% and 20.7%, respectively, during that same 3-year period. In your view, what are the key factors driving these persistent high price levels in Canada, and how is the Bank of Canada addressing these underlying issues?
So I think, I think you're talking about price level increases versus inflation rates. And I think this comes back to a question we had earlier about, inflation's back to target, we're bringing interest rates down, the economy is growing, why don't people feel better? And I think, the answer really is because things are more expensive. So we can say, yes, inflation's back to target, but people feel like things are more expensive, and they are more expensive. And so...
Do you expect those prices to come down?
No, not. I think we would be giving people a false sense of hope if we said prices come down. We get this question, wouldn't a bit of deflation be good after we've had a period of inflation? Wouldn't that get us back to normal, right? But just as inflation is a sign of an economy that's out of balance, that's overheating, deflation is a sign of an economy that's not operating at capacity. It's also out of balance. And what happens when you have deflation is sort of the opposite. People aren't, in inflation, when inflation is elevated, people are rushing out to make purchases, that demand's going up, it gets a bit of self...
Yeah. I wanted, you're sort of anticipating where I'm going, and that's, we've had, I know that you're reviewing your mandate, and you made a mention of looking at the last 3 years. So the last 3 years have been kind of perverse. Corporate profits rose very strongly in Canada in 2021 and 2022 when inflation was accelerating. But corporate profits have moderated as inflation decelerated. Wages, it was kind of the reverse. We have inflation at 1.6%. Wage growth has picked up. Current year-over-year wage growth is running 4 to 5%, depending on which measure you use. Back in 2022, when inflation was at 8%, wage growth was 3%. So inflation slowed down, wage growth sped up. So what does this tell you about the last 3 years of what caused this rapid acceleration of prices that apparently Canadians are expected to live with? You have 30 seconds.
You know, I mean, the governor covered this when we were talking about, you know, what have we learned, right? What have we learned? So in an environment where you have excess demand, you get shocks to supply, you're going to get a bigger reaction in inflation. I think what you're getting at is has there been a role for corporate profits, right? I mean, it's really, yeah. I mean, I think it's hard to disentangle corporate profits. How much of it was just that excess demand, you know, more volume? How much of it was more margin? We have looked at that. We have seen that in an environment of excess demand, companies do push their input cost increases through more. They're quicker to make price increases. Prices adapt more quickly. So that's true. We have seen that.
Thank you, MP Davies. And now to MP Morantz, please.
Thank you, Governor. I just wanted to circle back to what we were talking about earlier. I just had a chance to go look up what the mandate of the Bank of Canada is. It says that your mandate is to promote the economic and financial welfare of Canada, which begs the question, when you come to the Finance Committee and members of Parliament ask you questions related to the economic and financial welfare of Canada, that you should answer them. And what I'm also surprised about is that when I had my first round, you said you would not answer questions with respect to fiscal policy, that you were here to talk about monetary policy. But then when a Liberal MP asked you a question about fiscal policy, specifically what would happen if the carbon tax was eliminated and its effect on prices, you answered that question. So I'm starting to feel like if a Liberal asks you a question about fiscal policy, you're willing to answer it, and if a Conservative asks you, you're not willing to answer it. So I'm going to try again. Okay, fair enough. I withdraw.
Thank you.
But I would like to ask, fair enough. I would like to ask a hypothetical question, which is what my colleague asked you, though. If you make the assumption, based on economic policy, that increasing the capital gains tax would have an adverse effect on GDP, and this is just a hypothetical, would that have a negative impact on tax revenues for the government?
Your question is, if the economy slows, will tax revenues be lower? The answer is yes.
The answer is yes. If the economy slows, the tax revenues will be less.
Everything else equal, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the government has projected that the increase in the capital gains inclusion rate will raise about $19 billion over 5 years. And again, this is just a hypothetical. If in fact it becomes true, and there are other economists that are willing to speak to this, Jack Mintz was here and Ian Lee all said what you don't want to say, that it would adversely affect the GDP. Would it be fair to say that the projection of the government is not accurate in terms of the tax revenues received?
You have to take your tax projections, your fiscal projections up with the fiscal authorities, not the Bank of Canada.
Why would you?
I will happy to speak about our projections.
So why would you answer a question about fiscal policy from a Liberal
I have
MP?
answered, the reason I objective is I have answered many questions about the carbon tax from you and from your colleagues.
But arguably the capital gains tax is bigger than that. It's billions of dollars out of the economy.
Yes, but the carbon tax is, has a very direct effect on inflation. If you look at our forecast, when we publish our monetary policy report, we actually have a line that shows the impact of the carbon tax on inflation. It has a very direct effect on the thing that we are charged with controlling. And so, yes, I have a responsibility to respond because it is directly affecting our remit.
So we had Ian Lee here who projected that the capital gains inclusion rate would reduce, will increase the cost to Canada. It will cause a decline of 3% in GDP. Do you agree with that assessment?
I'm glad you've got experts coming in and giving you good advice on these issues. These are really important questions, and you should get the best advice from the best experts.
So at least in this context, you're not willing to promote the economic and financial welfare of Canada by answering a question of elected officials about a major tax. Is that correct?
I am directing questions on tax to the Government of Canada, to the Department of Finance. That is their responsibility. Our responsibility is monetary policy.
With the greatest of respect, Governor, I would suggest that when you come to the Finance Committee and elected officials ask you reasonable
order, Mr.
questions,
Speaker.
that you answer them. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chair, I would like some clarification. Mr. Morantz has said that he withdrew his comments earlier, so does that mean that they are struck from the record of this meeting?
You know, what I will say, P.S. Bendayan, is we expect respect and decorum for the witnesses that come before our committee. I believe the governor has made himself more than available. He's here for 2 hours, and the senior deputy governor, and the governor has answered MP Morantz, and MP Morantz did retract what he had to say earlier.
In fact, I'll go farther, Mr. Chair. I apologize for that. I really do. But I think my question is reasonable, and I think you should be
Point of order, I
answering
believe that Mr. Morantz's time is up, and if the Conservatives would like to go back to their partisan attacks on the Governor of the Bank of Canada, they may do so outside of this forum.
P.S. Bendayan, we've got 20 seconds, but I don't know if the MP Morantz? No? Okay, so we are off to our next, and we've got MP Thompson next, please.
Thank you, and welcome back with such good news. I can tell you the constituents in my riding are very pleased with the interest rate drop, and to know that it's the fourth consecutive. So, very, very good news. I want to just go back and ask this is sort of an additional question on the uncertainties. You reference uncertainties that we face in terms of forecasting. And I'm not trying to do the full list, but, you know, obviously global tensions, trade barriers. And I want to also ask if climate weather events are part of that, and saying that in light of, you know, the record breaking, which is a dubious record to break, but the record-breaking events of the past year. I mean, significant weather events that have, I mean, they have a toll on many levels, obviously, but there's still a financial toll. Does that become, the reality become part of your forecasting when around uncertainties?
I mean, what we're certainly seeing in recent years is the number of severe weather events, forest fires, it's not higher every year, but, you know, it's been a pretty clear trend. And if you look at obviously these are first and foremost impacting people, but if you look at it from a financial point of view, what you can see is the claims for P&C insurers keep going up. That's driving up the cost of insurance. Yes, it is having a financial impact. Obviously, when you're doing a forecast, the one thing you can't predict is what are the shocks. So we can't predict that we can't predict what the weather events are going to be. But yes, we know that, you know, these weather events are impacting people. They are adding cost. You know, we know the trend. We don't know the speed. We don't know what it's going to be one year to the next.
No, clearly, but does this speak that uncertainty? Is it now part of the conversation in terms of the unknown? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, going back to MP Baker, we are in the process of trying to build models, build some of this into our models. We are not there yet. It's a pretty new undertaking. So, you know, we can see the costs when they happen, but no, we don't have good models of them.
I think the difficulty for central banks, regulators, everybody, when you try and think about the effect of climate risks going forward, is we always use historical data as a way to proxy the future. And the thing with climate risk is we don't have enough historical data to be to build models with enough certainty to look forward. So, I mean, that's the difficulty. So you end up sort of trying to model the future without that, you know, the historical data.
I appreciate It is indeed challenging. It's our new reality, sadly. I want to just circle back to something, a thread of a conversation, a very recent one, on innovation. And certainly Newfoundland and Labrador, I'm always very proud to say it's a tremendous amount of innovative work happening, and it's really driving the economy moving forward. You referenced opportunity in a very general way. How do you see in your role, and it's not about policy, but how you see the opportunities for Canada moving forward in terms of there's so many phenomenal innovators and work happening in Canada that truly is leading the way forward.
I can say a couple things. As Senior Deputy highlighted, when it comes to scientific breakthroughs, true innovations, Canada is a leader. AI, quantum, health sciences. Where we've underperformed is in turning those innovations into commercially successful businesses. And too often, a Canadian invention gets turned into a successful business south of the border. I think our innovation ecosystem has improved a lot in the last 15 years. Where we're still having a hard time, though, is in achieving scale. We've done a lot better on startups. Where we're falling behind is achieving scaled, globally successful companies. We have some great examples, as I responded to the question to Mr. St. Marie, but we don't have as many as we'd like. So I think we need to be focusing more on scale. How do you achieve scale? And particularly in a more networked world, these returns to scale really matter. The second thing I will say is the U.S. is undergoing a big investment boom. The combination, first it was the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, CHIPS Act, there was some infrastructure investment. That certainly created investment. And now you're seeing, the AI boom that we're seeing around generative AI is very concentrated in the United States. Huge investments in compute, big investments in data centers. You've got, new investments in nuclear, in electricity. I think there are opportunities. We are sitting right next to the United States. There are opportunities for Canada to get into that supply chain. So there's a couple of thoughts.
Thank you, MP Thompson. I'm just looking at the time, everyone, and being mindful, and we thank the Governor and Senior Deputy Governor for the 2 hours that they've allocated for us here. So we're going to go about 4+ minutes per party, as we normally do when we don't have time for a full round. And we're starting with MP Howland.
Thanks, Chair. Since I have a limited time, Governor, I just wanted to ask you, yesterday you had commented about fixing Canada's productivity problems. One of the things you highlighted was about having foreign credentials recognized that could help people get into the workforce. I know there's many brilliant immigrants in this country that end up driving Uber or taxi that we know of that could be doctors, nurses, engineers. Would you agree that if we had something like a national program in which someone could take a test or prove their skill in a certain amount of time, something like 60 days, something like that, so that they can be trained here in Canada and their credentials could be recognized? And after that point, whether it's a pass or fail, if they pass, they could go into that field of work, such as a doctor or nurse, that could help not only our healthcare system, but with the productivity issues that we're having today.
I think that's the kind of innovative thinking we need. Whether it's a national or a mutual recognition of provinces, yes, that's the kind of thing we need.
I'm happy you just endorse our common sense conservative leader Pierre Poilievre's National Blue Seal program when he becomes Prime Minister. So thank you for that. I wanted to move on we saw that the Parliamentary Budgeting Officer recently came out with his report that the government is going to overrun their budget by $7 billion. What I wanted to know from you is that helpful in any way, not just for yourself, but for overall to our, fight in bringing down inflation? Does that help in any way? And if that trend continues, is that going to make things harder?
As I said, we're back to low inflation. The economy is actually in some excess supply. So,
question is just because that's happening, does it mean that you give yourself some free reins to spend
what
more?
it means is from the narrow perspective of monetary policy, there's less sort of tension between monetary and fiscal policy. When you're above target and you're trying to get it back, spending more than planned creates tension. When you're back to target, you've got some excess supply. It's less of a source. It's not my role to comment on what is the best fiscal policy.
Would you say it's not helpful?
As I say, I don't really feel I need to comment on fiscal
I'll
policy.
move on because I only have a limited amount of time. I know the bank likes to, give information that's digestible for Canadians. To Canadians watching today, in your opinion, is the economy today good or bad?
The economy is soft.
Okay. What does that mean for the 2 million Canadians?
It's not bad. It's not good.
Yeah.
It's soft.
Yeah. So
it needs to strengthen going forward.
But if we talk in relative terms of everyday Canadians that we know are suffering today, which you've acknowledged, it's the 2 million Canadians going to a food bank. It's the Tim Horton workers working in Timmins. And with GDP per capita coming down, what do you think they're thinking when they hear that soft? Like, what does that mean to them?
Well, actually, we have a pretty good sense of what they're thinking. We survey Canadians. What we're seeing is, on financial stress, yes, there's still some financial stress. They're feeling a little less stressed than they felt. They're feeling a little more optimistic than they felt. Are they feeling good? No.
Yeah.
But they're feeling a little better than they felt.
Right, and
we think that's going to continue to improve.
We established that those rent prices have gone up and it's staying stubbornly high. And when you look at the food bank users, 70% of them are renters. And they're the ones whose paychecks are 80% are being taken up by that. 1 in 5 of those food bank users are actually people who are employed. And food bank usage has doubled since 2019, doubled. It went from 1 million to more than 2 million people. Like, what does that say to those people or the state of our economy?
Well, I share your concern. There's no question that people at the lower end of income distribution are having a tougher time. Many of those are renters. If you look at financial stress, it's actually concentrated more in people that don't have mortgages, tend to be obviously they're renters. Whether it's their car loan, their credit card, that's where we are seeing more stress. That is a concern.
MP Howland, and now to MP Baker, please.
Thank you, Chair. Governor, by the way, for what it's worth, I didn't hear you endorse a Blue Seal plan of any kind. But if you're ever tempted, I would just say I'd be careful about that. Mr. Poilievre has a tendency of suggesting that certain people get fired, even when they're doing very, very good work. What I wanted to talk about was the impact of the rate cuts on people. So how would the most recent rate cut or series of rate cuts, how do you anticipate that people will feel that in their day-to-day lives?
It's very hard to generalize because it really depends a lot on your situation. If you have variable debt, whether it's a mortgage or any other form of variable debt, you'll feel it right away because your monthly payment will be smaller. If you're one of those people whose mortgage is renewing a year from now, and you're calculating the difference between what your payment is now and what it's going to be at rates now, you're probably feeling a little bit of relief because that difference is a bit smaller. So it's very hard to generalize. You kind of have to look at what situation people are in. But overall, I think even people that don't have variable debt and don't have a mortgage that's renewing, I think there is just a general sense of things are going back to normal. So,
one of the things that I wonder about, and I think I've asked both of you a question about this a number of meetings ago, which is on the issue of how people are impacted whose mortgages are rolling over. And I'm just wondering, I know it's going to depend on whether people were fixed or variable. If they were fixed, at what point their mortgage comes to term. I appreciate all of that. But could you just talk a little bit? I think in the past you've told us that this is something that you watch carefully, that you monitor carefully. So could you just talk to us a little bit about sort of your outlook for how folks are going to be impacted as mortgages come to term and they renew? And some folks are going to be renewing. Well, are they renewing at lower rates? Are they renewing at higher rates? I want to get a sense of how my constituents are going to be impacted in the coming months and possibly years in that regard.
So again, I think if you're one of those people who's anticipating a renewal, you're watching rates and you're doing the math probably every time we change rates. What's the change in my payment? More generally, I would say we've heard a few things as we talked to both consumers, mortgage holders, banks over the last couple of years. One is that Canadians are very prudent. We even through the great financial crisis, we never saw mortgage arrears go above 0.5%. So Canadians pay their mortgages. Now, do they cut back on other expenses or do other things to make sure they can do that? Absolutely. So we've heard from Canadians, well, I'm changing my spending habits, or I'm saving up so that I have a bit of a buffer when that renewal happens and I can pay down my principal. So I think there's a variety of things that Canadians are doing in anticipation of those renewals. But we're glad to be able to add to that by bringing rates down. And if the economy continues to evolve the way we think it will, there's room for them to come down a bit more. That'll help.
As you're thinking about your rate decisions, is this something that you take into account?
We always think about how our rates affect Canadians, how they affect consumers. It's not a sort of direct mathematical take it into account, but are we always thinking about the impact of our rate decisions on Canadians? Are we always thinking about, we use the broad term financial stability issues. Do we survey Canadians about levels of financial stress, their expectations? So yeah, absolutely.
Baker, MP Samari, please.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. In an article in today's Financial Post, they compare monetary policy. In a passage from that article, they say that the recent announcement of the drop in immigration rate will have an effect on the inflationary rate given housing and growth. First of all, I'm going to ask you, have you read that article? And if so, could you tell us if you think that it will reduce the rate? They talk about the possibility of another reduction in that article in your next announcements. So that could be a really good one. Well, let me start. While deciding what we're going to do in December will happen in December and not now. Now, with respect to the rise in the population and the implications thereof, two things I can tell you. First of all, the effect on the GDP is very direct. If there's less growth by consumers, a lesser effect on the GDP. But there are other things that are less clear. That population growth affects both supply and demand. When there are fewer new consumers, it's going down. But there are also fewer new workers who are moving into the economy, and therefore fewer potential resources. So the equation affects supply and demand. Yes, there are consequences for different sectors. There may well be less housing demand, and therefore there would be some downward pressure on the housing sector. but and fewer workers. But as I mentioned to Mr. Davies, we will look at the new plans in light of the forecasts that we have. If there's a drop in population next year, well, with the new plans, it could be lower. And we will look very closely at what is done for the next rate change. We've talked a lot about AI. There was a conference in Toronto on this matter, and you spoke about the possibility of AIs reducing productivity. If you have a minute and a half to expand on that notion, I'd be very grateful. Yes, this is a very large topic. There have been major innovations in AI that have been made here, right here in Canada. We are leaders in Toronto, Montreal, and Alberta in that area. But when you look at the use of AI in our businesses, there we are lagging behind on average, lagging behind the American business sector. So, yes, AI can increase our productivity rate. But the point of my speech was this. Probably that would take time. There will be uncertainties, but on the short term, we have to adjust the demand. There will be greater demand for workers who are familiar with and have the skills that are necessary in computing and, say, electricity. We can't understand all of the effects, but we will try to do so and try to maintain some sort of stability. Yes, there's an opportunity here for Canada, of course, because we're one of the founders of this AI industry.
Our final questioner.
And thank you again for taking time to be here with us. Governor, again, I think I mentioned that you're going to soon be in the process of renewing your inflation mandate. I noted in the 2021 mandate, some new language was added to instruct the bank to also pursue, quote, maximum sustainable employment, in addition to low and stable inflation. Could you tell us what maximum sustainable employment means in your view, and how those words in the mandate influenced your actions in the post-COVID inflation environment, if any?
Yeah, so maximum sustainable employment, it'd be lovely if it was so easy to just be able to give you a number. I can't give you a number. It's really a concept. And what does it mean by maximum sustainable? It's the maximum level of employment the economy could sustain without creating inflationary pressures. So that's what you mean by sustainable. If the economy a couple of years ago was very overheated, we had very high level of employment. We had a lot of job shortages, but it was not sustainable. It was creating inflation. Now we have some softness in the labor market. We could have more employment without creating inflation. That's an important reason why we're lowering interest rates. We do spend a lot of time looking at the labor market, and you can't summarize the labor market in a single statistic. It's not just the unemployment rate, it's the participation rate, it's younger workers, it's older workers, it's men, it's women, it's immigrants, it's students. You've got to look at the diversity. I mean, right now, the weakness in the labor market is very concentrated in newcomers to Canada and youth, as you've already highlighted. So you got to look at the overall health of the labor market, and that does factor in an important way into our monetary policy decisions. Our primary objective, and the mandate is very clear, our primary objective is price stability. But price stability or low inflation go hand in hand with strong employment. Because if you're missing jobs, you're missing incomes, you're missing spending, inflation's going to come down. So we do look at that very closely. We know that if we don't keep inflation well anchored, nothing is going to work well in the economy. So that's our primary objective. And
So you prioritize that over employment?
And that's the primary objective. And we spend a lot of time looking at employment because it's important in and of itself, and it's important to achieving our inflation objective.
Maybe an unfair question, but can you quantify for us in some way where we're at in terms of maximum sustainable employment? Like, we're very precise when it comes to the inflation. It's a little harder. I'm not looking for like a percentage
First
number.
of all, we don't have a target for maximum sustainable employment. We don't even know exactly where it is. When you get up closer, you sort of test the boundaries. Right now, we're below maximum sustainable employment. That's what we mean when we say the labor market's soft. There's some slack in the labor market.
There was a chart in our, we were using a chart in our monetary policy report for quite a while when the labor market was really tight. And it had, I think, about 10 different indicators, and we showed you sort of where we were sitting relative to sort of the record rates. So, I mean, that would be our best way to sort of summarize in a table the labor market. But.
Last question, maybe to Deputy Governor. You said in March of this year, Canada has many advantages that should lead to higher investment in productivity. So why isn't that happening? And what ought the federal government to do about it?
In 30 seconds.
Yeah.
With a number.
Yeah, I mean, as we've said sort of about 5 or 6 different ways tonight, there is no one magic thing. I mean, there's a reason that productivity has been a challenge for a while. There's a reason there's nobody sort of waved a magic wand and fixed it. I think the suggestion that came up tonight about finding ways to recognize credentials, both Canadians' credentials across provincial borders, and then having quicker credential recognition for people that we bring into our country. That's a good idea. I'm not aware of a Blue Seal program, but that concept of credential recognition would be a good idea if we could speed that up.
Thank you, MP Davies, and we want to thank the Governor, Senior Deputy Governor, for coming before Finance Committee and answering the many questions from the Bank of Canada on monetary policy. We also want to thank them, and we always welcome them, but we more welcome them when they come when we know that inflation is low and rate cuts are happening. So we'd love to have you here in January to tell us about more rate cuts and also to tell us about your comprehensive report on the pandemic. Thank you. We're adjourned.